At first, it would seem like a small change, the quiet disappearance of a tiny insect that most people barely notice. Gardens would feel a little quieter, fields a little less alive, but life would seem to go on as usual. Yet behind that silence, something much bigger would already be starting. So what would really happen to the world if bees went extinct? The answer turns out to be far more serious than most people imagine, and the consequences would reach farms, forests, and dinner tables around the globe. Today, we're exploring how the disappearance of one small insect could reshape life on Earth, right here, on History of Simple Things. The first and most immediate problem would be pollination. Bees play a critical role in moving pollen between flowers, allowing plants to produce fruits, seeds, and new generations of plants. While other pollinators exist, bees are especially efficient because they actively collect pollen as food and visit large numbers of flowers in a single trip. Without them, many plants would struggle to reproduce effectively. Some plants rely almost entirely on specific bee species to pollinate them, meaning those plants could quickly disappear if their pollinators vanished. Even plants that can technically survive without bees would produce fewer seeds and weaker populations over time. The result would be fewer flowering plants reproducing successfully, which would begin to reshape natural landscapes and agricultural systems alike. One of the biggest consequences would appear in agriculture. Many crops that humans rely on for nutrition depend heavily on bee pollination. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and crops like blueberries and cherries can rely on honeybees for a large portion of their pollination. Without bees, these crops would either produce far smaller harvests or become extremely expensive to grow. Farmers could attempt alternatives like hand pollination, but doing that at a large scale would require enormous amounts of labor and time. Some experimental robotic pollinators exist, but they are far too costly to replace billions of insects working freely in fields and orchards. As a result, grocery stores would start to look very different. Many fruits, nuts, and vegetables would become rare or dramatically more expensive. Even though food would still exist, our diets would become far less diverse and nutritious. A large portion of the calories humans consume comes from crops like wheat, rice, and corn, which are wind-pollinated and would still grow without bees. However, the foods that depend heavily on pollinators are often the ones that provide essential vitamins, minerals, and variety in our diets. Without reliable pollination, foods like apples, almonds, berries, squash, and many vegetables could become scarce. Over time, this shift could lead to widespread nutritional deficiencies, especially in regions that rely heavily on pollinator-dependent crops. The global food system would adapt, but it would likely move toward a narrower selection of staple crops, reducing the variety of foods available to people around the world. Beyond agriculture, the disappearance of bees would ripple through natural ecosystems. A large portion of wildflowering plants depend on animal pollination to some extent, meaning many species rely on insects like bees to reproduce successfully. If bees vanished, numerous plant populations would decline or disappear entirely, especially those with specialized relationships with specific bee species. As plants disappeared, animals that depend on those plants for food or shelter would also begin to struggle. Herbivores would lose important food sources, and predators would lose prey. Over time, this could trigger cascading effects through entire ecosystems, gradually reducing biodiversity in forests, grasslands, and meadows. Animals would feel the consequences as well. Many species depend directly or indirectly on plants that rely on bee pollination. When those plants decline, the animals that eat them would also decline, and predators that depend on those animals would be affected as well. Even species that feed directly on bees, such as certain birds, would lose a food source. These kinds of ecological chains mean that the extinction of one important species can trigger additional extinctions in a process sometimes called a cascade effect. The disappearance of bees wouldn't just remove a single insect from the environment. It would destabilize entire networks of species that evolved alongside them. Faced with these challenges, humans would likely attempt to replace bees with technology and manual labor. In some regions, farmers already hand-pollinate crops using brushes or cotton swabs, transferring pollen from flower to flower manually. While this method works in small orchards, scaling it up to entire agricultural industries would require huge numbers of workers and dramatically increase food prices. Researchers have also experimented with robotic pollinators and tiny drones designed to mimic insects. But these technologies are still experimental and extremely expensive. Even if such solutions became viable, they would struggle to match the efficiency, scale, and environmental role that billions of bees currently provide for free. If bees went extinct, humanity would not disappear overnight, but the world would become far more fragile. Food would be less varied and more expensive. Ecosystems would lose important plant species, and wildlife populations would decline as ecological relationships unraveled. The disappearance of bees would reveal how deeply interconnected life on Earth really is, where even the smallest creatures hold enormous influence over the stability of the planet. Bees are not just honey producers or garden visitors, they are essential workers in the global system that sustains plants, animals, and human societies. Their extinction would not cause instant collapse, but it would push the natural world into a long and difficult period of adjustment, one where the absence of a tiny insect would be felt almost everywhere. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.